Alright then, let's have a chat about rewards in the game, and specifically point systems, because I think they are kind of interesting when you think about them. One of Blizzard's big dick decisions, or what some may call a big dick decision with Warlords of Draenor, was removing Justice and Valor, a system that had its roots in the game all the way back in the Burning Crusade expansion. It was a really ballsy move, and I'll fully admit, it was one that I commended them for at the time. I thought it was a good move, and the reason why I thought that is, well, they sold me the idea of gold being the main currency of the game. Well, with gold being so throwaway in Warlords of Draenor, and the financial incentive of selling tokens, and the fact that gold doesn't always drive sort of dungeony gameplay and things like that, I'm a little bit less convinced now. And I do suppose, like, hindsight, it's 2020, and that's something Blizzard knows, okay? So I'm not trying to rag them over the coals here, I'm just trying to have a chat, because it's easy to talk about things in retrospect, rather than talk about them when it's just a loose theory. So let's set our sight on Justice first and cover that. From Wrath up, Justice was always the lower of the currencies. And it wasn't always called Justice back then, but it was the same thing. And the way that things worked out was that Justice bought old gear in an expansion, and it was very useful for your original gearing. This meant that running heroic dungeons was well incentivized, and it was actually one of the main ways of gearing up new characters, and it did involve quite a bit of playing the game in relevant group content. Personally, this system is what got me on the path from being an absolute fucking dish face at the start of Wrath of the Lich King to being a pretty good raider by the time ICC came out. And the dungeons were easy, but just being there, dealing with mechanics, and then seeing tanks and healers in action and things like that was all very useful experience, especially combined with the fact that eventually there were harder dungeons added into the game, and certainly when I tried to tank them for the first time, first time in quite a while anyway, like, I had to learn, I had to up my game, and I think driving that dungeon content is it's a very good thing, and it is something that Blizzard have admitted that we're doing less and less these days. So the first pro of having Justice is that it drove new characters to do relevant-ish content, and it was great for learning a new class at max level. Nowadays, we can alt up so quickly to max level, and then gear ourselves to near raid standard without really knowing how a class plays, and because it's so easy to get a new fresh alt, I think you get a lot of people, they try out a new class, they know roughly how it works, but they haven't really learned it, but they have good gear. And I think that might be just a little bit messed up. I think this system did teach you a bit more, and that could be better for the overall health. The next possible pro is actually to do with old gear and transmog. This pro didn't exist during Wrath, but with Cataclysm's transmog system, I think this gameplay was really opened up. If you wanted to purchase gear from a past expansion, it would cost you Justice points, and you got those Justice points from doing dungeons. This meant that players of all gear levels had a reason to hop back into dungeons, something that was actually very good for queue times, I would imagine, and meant that much of that old transmog gear was actually earned via playing the game. Nowadays that gear is super cheap and it just costs gold. Hell, you can actually run right back and buy loads of full Cataclysm sets just for gold, which is a bit weird. And since gold is so easy to get and the bits of gear are so very cheap, there's essentially no gameplay tied to actually getting them. Yes, it's far more convenient, but it's also less gameplay. The act of making a transmog out of some of that gear was a longer process back during, say, Mists of Pandaria, and it did involve more gameplay. I think that perhaps with that change to gold, it may have made the transmog process feel a little bit less rewarding. I think if you really had to spend just that little bit more time earning some of those bits of gear, then actually completing your transmog set might feel pretty good, or at least a bit better. Now, they are just the pros with the old system. If Blizzard were to re-implement this in a future expansion, I think they could really reap those benefits, but also create even more good new gameplay around them. iGold is more convenient, but convenience is often something that erodes at the overall game. It's the sort of thing you're really thankful for when it happens, but over the course of years and years of increasing convenience, what you generally find is that the quality of the game has been eroded to the point where it feels like something is missing, but maybe you just can't put your finger on what's actually missing. I think it just sort of erodes from the journey of it all, and in an RPG, that's not really something I like the idea of. Now, let's set our sights on Valor. So, Valor points were always the higher tier currency, and they were used to purchase gear with a similar item level to that of the current raid tier. They drop from raid bosses, and then from completing a daily heroic dungeon. There were also other methods of getting them that varied over time. For an example, in Mists you could get a hefty sum of them for doing a heroic scenario. Hell, at one point even daily quests gave you Valor points, something which I think resulted in people really feeling like they had to do a lot of dailies. Maybe not the best move. But anyway, what was really good about Valor points is they always gave you something to look forward to. No matter what your raid progression or gear lock was, you'd always have a bit of gear on the way. Now the downside is that was a highly deterministic system. You had a cap of like 1,000 per week, and that was that. It wasn't super fun, though I do think it did have some worth to it. It's very, very different from, I think, the equivalent of that system nowadays, which is actually the Garrison Raid missions. Think about it. You get a Garrison Raid mission every 2 weeks. Now, 2 weeks of capping Valor points would yield you about 2,000 Valor points, which was enough to purchase gear, though not in some slots, because say your chest piece would be that bit more expensive. The difference between these two systems of outside of raid gear progression is that earning Valor actually involved playing through loads of group content. You were doing dungeons, which was good for the dungeon queue times, and it nudged more antisocial people, myself included, into doing some group content. Nowadays, that gear is just obtained through logging into your isolated garrison and clicking on a menu. The Warlords of Draenor equivalent drives far less gameplay and far less interaction than the past systems, which essentially achieve the same thing. Now, while it does have its cons for sure, I think the Valor point system is better for the health of the game overall than what's going on now. Certainly, it seems like logging in once per fortnight for a Garrison Raid mission hasn't been as good for player retention as perhaps the old system was. So I do think that having Valor points, perhaps paired with maybe a raid reputation, would be a good way of doing things. I'd have Valor points drop from a daily heroic as well as drop from mythic dungeons in accordance with the weekly lockout of those dungeons. Hell, if they were going right into Warlords of Draenor, I'd be okay with some Valor points even coming from the follower or shipyard missions, just as long as it doesn't go above the weekly cap. And yes, I would have a weekly cap. I think it's very important to have a cap so that you prevent players from burning themselves out. Believe me, if you uncap Valor and then tell raiders they can have 5 bits of Valor gear, they will binge that content until they are blue in the face, they'll earn it all within 2 days, and then they'll be burnt out as hell and won't enjoy the game. As much as that is their own fault, it is something that you've got to manage when you're thinking about the design of a game like this. And again, like with what I said about Justice, if Blizzard were re-implementing Valor, they would have a chance to improve and refine the system. So I like the idea of having some cosmetic Valor items. It would mean that Valor points would actually be useful past the initial gearing process. Perhaps some transmog helms, shoulders, and weapons. Basically just fun stuff like that. Like in Mists of Pandaria, I would have a buff to Valor point acquisition on your alts once you reach the character's weekly cap. I think that's just the most player-friendly way of doing things because, well, if you've got a few alts, you don't want to be doing like the full grind on every single alt every week. I think that is definitely too much. So that's really most of my thoughts on the topic covered. In short, I think the old system drove more gameplay and it drove more social interactions. Many of the rewards took more effort, which I think boosted up the sense of accomplishment in the game in general, and that was probably a good thing. But that's really it for my thoughts. Let me know what you think about the topic. Thanks very much for watching the video.